Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for that introduction. This sounds like a wonderful organization you have, and wonderful speaker series, and I am just ecstatic to be a small part of it. So, yeah. So today, can I start sharing my screen? Yeah. There we go. Okay. Today I want to talk to you kind of about my research and specifically my recent book, which was published by University of Illinois Press last year, titled "Strong Winds and Widowmakers: Workers, Nature, and Environmental Conflict in Pacific Northwest Timber Country." And what this book argues, to put it in its most simplest terms, is that timber workers, people who make their living logging, working in sawmills, and other aspects of the timber industry, are environmentalists. And they're not just environmentalists. What I suggest in all of my research and what I will suggest to you today is that they're actually some of the best environmentalists. So by way of introducing that argument and kind of telling you a little bit more about my research, I kind of want to tell you how I came to this research and I started coming to these conclusions and thinking of timber workers as environmentalists. So I grew up in suburban Chicago, which is a place that is both geographically and socioeconomically distant from Pacific Northwest timber country. I grew up in a fairly affluent neighborhood where I didn't think about logging. It's that if someone was doing a home improvement project, the timber just magically appeared in the aisles of the hardware store. I really didn't give logging or loggers a second thought. That is until about the mid 1990s when the spotted owl conflict exploded. So I can spotted owl conflict a little more. I know it did reach up into British Columbia a little bit. You definitely British Columbia, there were other conflicts over old growth forests and ancient forests and logging versus preservation. But really in the United States, in Oregon, Washington, it really centered on the spotted owl, this little diminutive bird that some wildlife biologists claimed was, its population numbers were declining rapidly as a result of overlogging. And this became a big, or reporting on this issue kind of spread across the nation that, you know, like me, this was the first time a lot of people were hearing about loggers and logging in Washington and Oregon, that they were actually thinking about loggers and logging in Washington. And generally, the way this conflict played out was you had environmentalists from the mainstream to the radical, really putting pressure on the Forest Service, putting pressure on state politicians, as well as federal politicians to significantly curtail and in some cases end logging. And then on the other side, you had loggers, many of them from very economically depressed rural communities, who said more logging restrictions are going to put us out of work and do even more economic and social damage to our communities than has already been done. And so the spotted owl conflict, or the timber wars, as they came to be called, was this really intense moment where it seemed that you had environmentalists on one side and loggers on the other. And too often, the way the story was reported was that the environmentalists were the good guys and the loggers were the bad guys, that the environmentalists had an ecological consciousness, that they had the foresight to push for protections before even more damage was done to the forest ecology. And timber workers were often portrayed as the bad guys, part of kind of this backwards, rural, frontier mythology. They couldn't understand that logging was no longer had a place in the modern world. They were fighting or grasping to hold on to a dying culture and a dying world. They were angry and they were bitter. And I think the image you see there, that is a anti-spotted owl protest led by loggers in Salem, Oregon in 1991. That's kind of a lot of the images that most people in the United States, at least those living outside of timber country, were familiar with. loggers who seemed angry, who seemed bitter, who seemed like they really didn't care about the forest ecology so long as they had a job. So these are the images that I kind of grew up with. Spotted owl conflict peak in the mid 1990s. That's when I had just kind of started high school and I was starting to pay attention to the news. And because I lived in suburban Chicago, far away from Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, where these conflicts were happening, my only relationship with them was through the news and through these sorts of stories. And I believed, like I think most Americans and perhaps Canadians as well did, was that the environmentalists were the good guys, the loggers were the bad guys. That the loggers didn't care about the environment, they only cared about their jobs. Um, so sometimes the story or your research, sometimes you find the historical story or the research. Sometimes the historical research or the story finds you. And for me, it was definitely the latter. So I had the good fortune to go to graduate school in Seattle at the University of Washington. And in my early days of my graduate program, I probably didn't spend enough time reading, and I spent far too much time in places like this. So this is the Hoh River on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. It is one of my absolute favorite places in the world. It is a beautiful place, but more importantly, at least as far as I'm concerned, it is a very, very good river for steelhead fishing. And that is one of the reasons I actually applied to go to graduate school in the Pacific Northwest, is because I fish and I hunt, and I knew that graduate school out there would provide me or put me very close to some of the best steelhead fishing rivers in the world, as well as some really, really good elk and deer hunting. And like I said, perhaps in my first couple years of graduate school, I spent a little bit too much time out in the woods and on the rivers and not enough time reading and in the archives. But in ways I didn't necessarily realize at first, even though I was out there fishing and hunting and hiking and backpacking and doing all these things, research was occurring. So the thing, and this is true in British Columbia as well as it is in Washington and Oregon, most good steelhead rivers flow through or nearby logging towns. The best hunting is often on lands that have been logged, sometimes clear cuts, sometimes other kind of forest lands. That's just has the best habitat. And it just so happens that if you spend enough time fishing or hunting in the Pacific Northwest, you are going to run into your share of loggers because they are out there doing exactly what I was out there. They were out there fishing and hunting. Um, so like I said, research was occurring. I'd always stop and talk with these folks anytime I could. If for no, in part because I was getting more interested in the history of the timber industry, and for the other reason is then, I figured if I talked to a logger, then when my academic advisors asked me what I was doing all weekend, I could say I was, out there doing research. Never mind that I was. But like I said, research in a way was occurring because what I quickly discovered in talking to these folks was that a lot of these ideas that I had about loggers and a lot of the images that I had thought I had learned during the news reporting of the spotted owl conflict really were wrong, or at best, they were only a very small part of the story of how people in the timber industry understand the forest, understand the natural environment, and how they see their place and their role in the natural environment. And indeed, these folks talked about nature and talked about these rivers and talked about these forests with a deep respect and a deep reverence. And what I quickly learned after enough conversations was that they cared just as much for these places and these forests as any environmentalist from Seattle or Portland or Vancouver. And in fact, I learned that arguably, they cared more for these places because these places were their homes. They had a vested interest in protecting them, not just for their beauty, not just for the sake of ecological preservation, but because these were the places that they relied on for recreation, for work, for all sorts of activities, and that their families relied on, and that they hoped their future generations would have these places to rely on. So that's when I kind of said to myself, like, hey, I bet there's an interesting story here. And that is what led me down this kind of path of researching timber workers and kind of their relationship to the environmental movement and environmentalism. And, I really wanted to understand how timber workers saw their relationship to the environment. And I wanted to get beyond the sort of simplistic stories that had been told during the era of the timber wars and have been told by journalists and some academics since. So I wanted to understand and tell a more complicated story about nature and workers in the Pacific Northwest. So I did what any historian would do, is then I just started digging into the archives, and this time actually going to archives, not just spending time in the forest. Really kind of trying to find an origin point of where workers, really started expressing and, pro-environmentalist ideas, pro-ecological ideas. And before I knew it, I was back in the early 20th century looking at, records left by workers and companies and finding evidence of workers expressing deep reverence and care and concern for the natural world. So when it came time to kind of write a dissertation and then a book, that is where I started. And indeed, the story I tell, and much this begins in the early 20th century and spans kind of from 1900 all the way to the present. And one of the things I demonstrate is that, or talk about a lot, is that, timber workers have not only had a concern for how their labor and how their work and how the industry they work in is affecting the environment, but they very much saw themselves as stewards of the land. They sometimes believed that their employers could not be counted on to take care of the land. And especially in the early 20th century, there were, outdoor enthusiasts, but this is before highways. This is before it's, easy to sometimes get into the backwoods of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. They believed that it was their not only responsibility, but their duty to really be the kind of, like I said, stewards or protectors of the forests. And so I root a lot of this way of thinking into the places where workers lived in the early 20th century. And that is the company town. Starting in about 1910 until about 1940s, around the World War II era, most timber workers lived in company towns. This was in part because it was just a geographic necessity. Like I said, this is an era before railroads, or excuse me, this is the era of railroads, but it's an era before highways. It's an era when most workers don't own their own cars. And so employers need a way, and also where logging is taking place fairly far away from cities, and employers need a way to house their workforces and keep their workforces close to the point of production, keep them out in the forest. So they have to build them housing for them and their families. At the same time, this is, company towns serve a similar function in Pacific Northwest woods as they do in other places. It is a kind of tool to control workers and keep out the radical labor movement. So most workers, at least those outside of sawmills and bigger cities, are living in company towns. Now, company towns looked and functioned a little bit different in the Pacific Northwest timber industry than they did in other industries. If you have a mining town, you can rely on that town, or you can rely on the town to support the mine or the mine to support the town for 20, 30, maybe 40 years. Logging is a little bit different. A town would only be able to or be usable for 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years on the long end, just because so much wood is being logged. Before you know it, all the surrounding timber has been harvested and you have to move the town. So employers didn't invest a lot into their towns. This is a railroad logging camp. Most of these towns weren't even given a name. They were just called camps. Some were given names, but you can kind of get a sense from this picture here. This is from 1928, that these were not very kind of luxurious places to live. Quite to the contrary, those houses leaked. Uh, the houses weren't really put together. You see that train track running right through the middle of town. There's stories of workers talking about how every time, a train rumbled through, batting and shingles on their house would fall down and be rattled off. And so one of the things, and again, when I talk about this in my Pacific Northwest history class, this is where I put the picture up on the PowerPoint slide and ask students to say like, hey, what do you think it was like to live in these places? And so again, you can kind of mentally do that exercise, think about what it might have been like to live in these places. First of all, there's no real separation between the human world and the natural world. Wind and rain is getting into these houses. Mice are getting into these houses. Deer and elk are wandering through these camps. So people that gives kind of people a kind of close connection to nature immediately. But arguably, the more important thing is that workers really had to look to the forest for their daily subsistence, as well as their recreational needs. Now, employers sometimes did provide food and cookhouses, at least sometimes for single men. But for the most part, families, what they did was they would order durable goods, sacks of grain, things like that, from kind of mail order catalogs, and they'd be delivered on the train. But for the most part, a big part of their diet is foraging in the forest, hunting in the forest, fishing in the rivers. At the same time, too, in other industries where employers build company towns, they'll sometimes build, or they'll actually often build recreational facilities. And, again, the whole idea is if workers are occupied with recreation, they're going to be happier and they're not going to, be filling their minds with kind of radical or talk of radical unions. But for the same reasons, most employers in logging company towns really didn't bother with recreational facilities, simply because these towns were kind of transient and impermanent. So workers are also doing things like taking hikes, and they are, sometimes going cross-country skiing, things like that. I remember I had an aha moment during the course of my research. I was reading an oral history, a series of interviews taken from a bunch of residents who lived in an Oregon logging town called Shevlin in the 1920s. And Shevlin was located near Bend, Oregon. If you don't know where that is, it's kind of in the middle of the state, kind of in the high mountain Cascades. And Shevlin, by all accounts, and from pictures I've seen, looked very similar to this picture here, right? A very kind of rough, rugged town where the homes are very permeable, where it is you feel the elements. And so I'm reading this oral history, and the interviewer asks one of the interviewees, "Oh, okay, so when you shut down for the summer during fire season, what would you do for fun?" And the person says, "Oh, we'd go camping for a couple weeks." And I didn't think anything of it at the time. And then, a week or so later, I'm just doing something else, and it pops in my head like, wait a second, they went camping? I have a very fancy tent. I have a very fancy sleeping bag. I have Gore-Tex everything, right? And yet, if I lived in a place like this year round, where the rain is coming through my, house, where mice are, scurrying through my house, where I'm essentially camping. The first thing I would do with some time off is go find a nice hotel somewhere in a city. And that was an aha moment for me because I said, wow, these folks have a real deep connection to nature. They care about nature. They love spending time in nature. And even when their life is so, their day-to-day life is lived so close to nature that when they have time off, when they have an opportunity to maybe go or do something else, what do? They go camping for a week or two. And that was an aha moment for me for several reasons. One, just the like, wow, these people were really serious about being outdoors. But the other aha moment for me was, and this is something I argue in my book and in a lot of my research, is that when we talk about work and workers, we often think about the labor process. We think about the logging process, and most of the history that has been written about timber workers is about the logging process and the labor process, and that stuff is really important and it is really, really interesting. But what I realized is that one of the reasons that most people, I think, have misunderstood the environmental consciousness of timber workers is because they have focused too much on work. And that we have to expand our view of the history of timber workers beyond work to really understand how they related to the environment and how they thought about the environment. So that was the aha moment. And that's when I decided to, yeah, I'm going to talk about work in my research, but I'm also going to talk about the other ways timber workers used and experienced the forest. And that is when I found all sorts of evidence of them foraging in the woods and them hunting in the woods, of them, taking long hikes in the woods. And what I realized and what I, came to argue was that they really see the forest as a place capable of supporting multiple uses and multiple kind of ends. So one of the other things that kind of shocked me is, I'm reading, a lot of times I'll be reading oral histories with workers, interviews with workers, memoirs left by workers, and they would be describing these beautiful forests and these lush forests, and they'd be talking about like all the, game they're hunting, making me jealous, talking about all the deer that they see and all the elk that they see. Um, and then it dawned on me like, oh, they're actually up there though. They're not just spending time hunting and fishing in the woods. They're up there to do logging. And indeed, a lot of times the company towns were surrounded by scenes like this, vast clear cuts. And what loggers, I think, came to believe starting in the early 20th century, and I would argue many believe up until to this day, and this is something that would ultimately put them into conflict with environmentalists in the later 20th century, is that logging isn't inherently or necessarily bad. And in some cases, logging can actually be beneficial to the environment. So these things I talked about, grouse, deer, berries, these things all need sunlight. And in fact, deer kind of live in kind of transitional forest spaces. They don't like the deep forest. They don't like clear cuts. They like those kind of in-between spaces. Same thing with grouse and a lot of other forest animals. Berries need sunlight to grow. A lot of other species need sunlight to grow. And once trees are removed through a clear cut, sun can kind of reach the forest floor, and there can be a forest regeneration. So a lot of us see, we look at an image like this and we go, oh my God, this is horrendous. This is awful. This is ugly. But what we don't necessarily know and understand and think about is that forests are dynamic environments in dynamic spaces. They're always changing. And while this particular snapshot in time, that's what a photo is, a snapshot in time, looks horrendous by many stretches of the imagination, what we have to realize is that this is going to change. And in 2, 3, 5, 10 years' time, this is going to be a completely new forest that is regenerating, regrowing, providing new wildlife habitat, new trees, and one day, with enough and proper planning, new timber to harvest. And because workers were living in the forest, and because they saw how these landscapes changed, they gave a very different view of the relationship between the timber industry, logging, clear cuts, and environmental stewardship and the forest ecology. And what timber workers argued was that a healthy forest is one with a mixture of stand structures. That you can't have just a uniform sea of old growth. That is not a healthy forest. Nor can you have, just clear cuts that spread on for miles. That's not healthy either. What timber workers in the 1920s began to argue, and timber workers throughout the 20th century would argue, was that you need a good mixture of forests, and logging can be a tool you use to manage forests and to make sure that the forests remain healthy. So this view of multi-use forestry, that we need a mixture of stand structures, really shapes loggers and the way they view environment, the history of the environment, or the way they view the forest environment over the course of the 20th century. And really, much of the history of timber country from the 1920s onwards is workers organizing politically in order to maintain a balance between a healthy timber industry and logging, as well as a healthy forest and protected areas. And this is one of the main things that drives the creation and the large membership of the major union that I study, the International Woodworkers of America. So even though, I should say too, even though it's called International Woodworkers of America, it was actually started by British Columbia loggers. It's a long, complicated, not terribly interesting story of how they got the America in their name, but it is much a British Columbia union as it is an American union. And really, it's workers' desire to, protect the forest and make sure that logging doesn't, that the, insofar as they want to maintain a balance between logging and preservation, that logging doesn't take precedence. And so, workers say that the best way we can hold employers accountable, as well as, improve our own lot and our own economic welfare and the economic welfare of our families, is by organizing and joining unions, because that is where workers are going to have the most power to control or put pressure on their employers and force them to adopt not only or adopt safer logging practices, safer not only for workers, but safer for the forest themselves. And the IWA, especially in the post-war period following World War II, really makes a lot of great leaps forward on this in terms of wilderness preservation. What the IWA believes is that by expanding wilderness areas and by, putting pressure on legislative bodies, both in the US and Canada, to expand wilderness areas, what that will do is it will lock up some timber, it will preserve some timber, which will decrease the supply that employers have access to, and it will force them to manage their own stands more responsibly. So that is their goal, that is their desire. And they also say, hey, wilderness is great for working class recreation. Those things we love to do, hunting, fishing, wilderness will make sure we have that. So in the 1950s, the IWA makes a concerted effort to expand wilderness areas. The two examples I have here are actually from the United States. I should have put some examples up from British Columbia, but I do have a BC example coming up, though, in a minute here. But what I discovered in the course of this research is Olympic National Park, where the Hoh River is, that I love to fish, is actually there in part because of advocacy by the IWA, as well as the Three Sisters Wilderness, a wilderness area very close to where I live now. So again, in both these campaigns, it wasn't solely the IWA, but the IWA was working with the environmental movement at the time, because both had similar beliefs about, the need to preserve wilderness, reduce the supply of available timber, which would then put pressure on big timberland owners to manage their existing stands more sustainably. And ultimately, this partnership between wilderness advocates and timber workers led to the passage and signing of the Wilderness Act in 1964, which in the United States was a landmark act that made it much, much easier for Congress to expand wilderness. British Columbia and Canada had similar systems that were somewhat modeled after the US. But starting, and this is something I detail more in the book, the politics of it, as you might imagine, get complicated. Starting though in the 60s, there's kind of a diverging path between kind of British Columbia timber industry and the American timber industry. They start going in radically different directions, both in terms of environmental politics as well as kind of how the timber industry is developing. But needless to say, and the point is that both in British Columbia as well as the United States, the IWA is really one of the leading voices of forest preservation and wilderness areas. Well, so what happens? Why is it that, by the 1970s and 1980s, and definitely by the 1990s, we see timber workers acting and behaving and talking very differently about nature? Well, what I suggest in a lot of my research is that they're actually not talking very differently about nature. One of the things I said earlier was that, timber workers really want to maintain a balance between wilderness and working forests, a balance between harvestable timber and wilderness, a balance between, areas dedicated for recreational space and, wildlife habitat, and areas dedicated for logging. And in the 1930s, 1940s, and especially the 1950s, when there was a lot of timber being cut because of the post-war housing boom, timber workers believed that the greatest threat to maintaining that balance is presented by the timber industry. And so they believe that, okay, we have to maintain that balance by protecting and expanding wilderness areas. Well, by the 1980s, wilderness acts and wilderness legislation in both British Columbia and America have been so successful that there is a massive, massive expansion of wilderness areas and protected areas. And then when the spotted owl conflict begins and environmentalists start calling for even more forest protections, timber workers, yeah, they lash out, they get angry, but what they're ultimately saying is that, the balance now is tipping too far in the other direction, that we don't have enough, you know, timber to maintain rural economies, to maintain rural communities, and we don't have enough timber, or we're not going to have enough timber to, you know, fulfill, the kind of, housing, the demands of the housing industry, as well as all the other places that timber exists. So when, a lot of those angry images that the media reported on, what I argue is that they fundamentally misunderstood what timber workers were arguing for. Yes, they wanted their jobs. Yes, they wanted to protect the economic well-being of their families and their communities. But what they wanted to ensure was that we had a healthy balance between forest preservation, forest conservation, and forest production. So the guy you see here, this is Wilbur Heath. He's someone I interviewed in the course of my research. He has since passed away, but I talked with him for several hours. It was a wonderful, great conversation. And this was a picture that appeared in Life magazine, where they brought a spotted owl to the photo shoot and had the owl pose on his shoulder. And if you read the copy here, it says endangered species. An owl and a logger symbolize the nation's tough choice: jobs or the environment. And Wilbur Heath said, that kind of framing, and this was not just Life magazine that framed it this way. This was politicians framed it this way. It was Forest Service officials and wildlife biologists. A lot of people framed it as jobs or the environment. And what Wilbur Heath said, and what a lot of loggers I talked to who lived through this era said, was that we never saw it as an either or. We wanted jobs and the environment. And really, loggers believed they could have both. They believed that history had shown they could have both. One of the things, I got a quote from my interview with Wilbur Heath here. He said, "I didn't hate the owl. I didn't hate really wilderness. Really, I think we could have come to a pretty good compromise." And that's really what Wilbur Heath wanted, was a compromise, a way to kind of, he didn't want to be fighting with environmentalists. He wanted to be working with them to figure out how we manage the forests for a host of needs. Now, the story of the spotted owl conflict, and there's a similar story in British Columbia, even though the spotted owl didn't come up there, is that ultimately it's environmentalists who more or less, insofar this is a war, it's more or less environmentalists who win this war. And logging, at least in Oregon and British Columbia, experiences a significant downturn. And it does a lot of social and economic damage to a lot of rural communities. And at the same time, it actually doesn't really benefit the forest because, again, maybe some of you in the audience who are can certainly speak to this better than I am, or ecologists can speak this better than I am. But an unmanaged forest is not necessarily a healthy forest. Is that, I think the environmental movement believed, especially in the late 20th century, some environmentalists kind of still believe this to today, is that the best thing you can do to protect nature is to not touch it. And sometimes that can be true. But what has happened in the Northwest is in 1994, the Clinton administration essentially issued what was called the Northwest Forest Plan, which mandated preservation along wide swaths of timberland throughout Oregon and Washington. And that prevented not only a lot of logging, but a lot of active management, things like forest pre-commercial thinning or non-commercial thinning, as well as controlled burns, things like that. And the forest just started overgrowing. The forest, became clogged with all sorts of kind of undergrowth problems. There were beetle infestations. One of the reasons that we were having such catastrophic wildfires, at least here in Oregon, and again, there's a lot of reasons why incidents of wildfires increasing, mostly climate change, but is that forests just haven't been managed properly over the past 30 years, and there's just too much growth in these forests because they haven't been thinned and cleared either through commercial or non-commercial activities. And so that's why we're seeing this kind of blow up of fires. So, in a way, in a sad way, history has proven folks like Wilbur Heath Wright is that, he said it doesn't have to be jobs or the environment. We can have jobs and a healthy environment. In fact, logging, and this goes back to this kind of way of thinking that was rooted in the early 20th century. Logging, when done incorrectly, can be really bad for the environment. But when done correctly, when done responsibly, and certainly someone like Wilbur Heath saw himself as a very responsible, timber worker. When it's done correctly and responsibly, it can benefit the environment. You can have jobs. And this is one of the reasons, I start off by saying, one of the things I argue is that, I see timber workers as the best environmentalists. And it's because of folks like Wilbur Heath that I say that, is that it's easy to say we should just preserve all timber, that any sort of industrial activity in the forest is bad. That's easy. But what we forget is that, we all rely on timber. Obviously, people like Wilbur Heath, people who come from rural logging communities, they directly rely on employment in the timber industry. That is their well-being. But, we all probably live in structures made of wood. Right now, I'm sitting at a desk that is made of wood. Timber products find their way into all sorts of other things. I would love it if some of you go out and buy my book. Not a digital, but you can buy a digital copy. Appreciate anyone who purchases my book, but you buy a paper copy. That paper was once wood, right? Wood finds its way into all sorts of other products. Wood products are in paint, in pharmaceuticals, in cosmetics. Our modern world still relies to a great extent on good old-fashioned wood. So it's a little too easy to say we should just preserve forests. The more complicated question, yet the more important question, I think, is how do we, maintain the modern economy in the modern world? How do we maintain enough wood to make sure our economy grows and is healthy? And how do we maintain wildlife habitat, recreational space outdoors, and all those other values that the forest has? And timber workers, I think, certainly more than kind of modern environmentalists, have really thought about that trickier question, and throughout their history sought that balance between the economic uses of nature and the aesthetic, biological values of nature, and sought to find a balance between those. And so one last point before I wrap up, I'll say is that, one of the things when I wrote this book is that I was very determined to bring it up to the present, because I had so many timber, most histories of the timber industry, they end in the 1990s. They say, oh, that's when logging ended. Now, definitely the logging industry in both British Columbia and Pacific American Northwest really took a hit as a result of the spotted owl conflict. But logging still occurs, and loggers still, and the timber industry still has a lot to teach us about how we find this balance between preservation and economic uses of forest, how we balance the kind of varied uses of the forest. So the final kind of chapter of my book, I also am working on another article about kind of the timber industry since spotted owl conflict. But the final chapter in my book really details this company, Southport Lumber, and it was co-founded by a man named Jason Smith. And I decided to tell the story of Southport because actually a former student of mine is Jason Smith's daughter, Peyton Smith. She comes up to me in class one day and says, so Southport is in Coos Bay, a very proud working class rural logging town. And she, I was given some of this history in one of my classes, and she comes up to me and goes, I never thought I'd come to Eugene and University of Oregon and have a pro-logging professor. This is great. So I, talked to Peyton. We remained or became friends once she graduated, and I talked to her a lot. She actually now works for her father's company, but I interviewed her and several people from her company, or her father's company. I interviewed Jason as well. And what I found is that even to this day, the timber industry is still carrying forward these ideas of finding a balance between, how to conserve as well as preserve as use forest lands. So Southport, like I said, is a perfect example of kind of a model timber company. It buys up a lot of cutover lands. It replants them. Yes, it's replanting them so that it can one day harvest them. But, as Jason told me, those trees aren't going to be harvestable until I am, well gone from this earth. Some of you who are foresters know you got to think 40, 50, 100 years in the future. And that is definitely the way Southport is thinking. So he's like, yeah, we're replanting them for economic reasons, but we're replanting them because it's the right thing to do. Southport is also experimenting with solar power and all sorts of ways to make their business more kind of sustainable. And again, they're very picky about which trees they harvest, which trees they let grow. They allow, on some of their lands, they allow hunters because they have, created really good elk habitat through their management practices. Point is that even though you don't hear as much about the timber industry as you might have once had, and it's no longer near as central to the economy, of the Pacific Northwest, these ideas and these values are still an important part of the timber industry. And I think by listening to these workers and talking to people like Jason Smith and Peyton Smith, I think we could adopt a more, I think, conscientious environmentalism, one that really is tentative to the demands we place on the forest and how we balance those demands. Like I said, the economic demands as well as our desire to have healthy wildlife habitat and recreational space. So as a way to close out, I want to tell a story because I think this story is kind of a perfect example of a lot of things and themes I talk about in the book. And here's a British Columbia. The story comes from British Columbia, so probably hits a little closer to home for many of you. And so this story takes place on May 29th, 1990. I should add, this is right at the height of the timber wars. The spotted owl conflict is raging in the Pacific Northwest. And up in British Columbia, this is right around when there is a lot of conflicts between workers and radical environmentalists. Clayoquot Sound is one of the big ones, but there's a few other places where there's kind of these big debates going on about ancient forest and preservation. And where most people are, or where these kind of new narratives of workers, bad guys, only care about their jobs, environmentalists, good guys, foresight with the future. Right when these narratives are being ingrained in the public consciousness, this happened. So May 29th, 1990. So three timber fallers, Don Zapp, Dave Morrison, and Dave Luoma, they are working a forest tract in the Sayward Valley on Vancouver Island. And I've been up there. It's absolutely beautiful. And they're told by their boss, by the company, Bledel Donovan, to go ahead and cut these trees in this area. They're given a map, show them where to cut, and say, follow these trees. Well, about halfway through their day, Zapp, Morrison, and Luoma stumble upon this valley of just incredibly, incredibly large trees. So most of the trees in this area were, probably about 150 years old, definitely old growth timber. But the trees they ultimately find are, these guys guess over 200 years old. They're definitely taller, much larger, much wider than all the trees they've been cutting that afternoon. So they spend a couple hours wandering around this grove, just kind of marveling in these trees. They think they hear an elk herd, they see elk sign. They're elk hunters, so they know, about this stuff. They're like, wow, this is amazing. This place is, just boggles the imagination. What foresters and wildlife ecologists would later figure out was that this grove kind of sits in a deep depression. And so it's trees that kind of remain hidden from human view. And when this area was surveyed, the surveyors really didn't see this area because it kind of sits in this depression. So they thought these trees, they just looked at the canopy. They said, oh, these trees are the same height as everything else. But when they got down in this grove, they said, oh my God, these trees are actually much, much larger than anything. So even though their orders from their boss or from their employer to cut these trees, these guys say, you want to know what? We are not going to do it. So this is actually a picture from the IWA's newspaper. And you see it says here, Faller's risky decision. It was a risky decision. What they did was they, as soon as they see this grove, they say they're not going to cut it. They get in their truck, they drive back to town. And the first thing they do is they go into their employer's office and say, we found this grove. We are not going to cut it. Fire us, take disciplinary action if you want, but we aren't going to cut this stand. Almost immediately, the IWA, which again, these men are IWA members, they issue a statement that says, if any disciplinary action is taken against Zapp, Morrison, and Luoma, you are going to hear from us. We are going to resist that. And, if no other member of this union is going to cut this timber either. And again, it was called a risky decision because this is the 1990s. Timber workers are losing their job left and right. This wasn't a time for three guys to be going into their employer's office saying, we aren't going to cut timber, take disciplinary action if you must. But like I said, their union backed them up. And then what happened, and I love this story, is that people from the town, some of them out of work loggers who would have been desperate for a job, say, hey, you want to know what? We are not going to let the company cut this stand either. And they go and they set up a little protest camp in this grove. And they say, we are going to stay here until we get an assurance from the company that they're going to let this stand be. So ultimately, Bledel pushed its rights to this timber. It gave them back to the British Columbia Provincial Forest Service. And eventually it was turned into White River Provincial Park. And this is if you go there today, you can actually read this plaque, and it tells the story of Zap Morrison and Loma. And yeah, it's essentially these three timber fellers who found this area and demanded from their employer that it become a protected area. So, like I said, I think this sums up a lot of the storytelling. It's a really good story to illustrate a lot of things I've been talking about. These guys, they were timber workers. They depended on logging for their livelihoods. And again, throughout the first half of the day, they were cutting timber. They had no moral qualms about that. But they also said there has to be limits, that we have to strike a balance between preservation and economic use. And in some cases, we can cut timber, and that will provide jobs, that will provide homes. But in other places, we have to just let the timber go, or let the timber stay. That provides habitat, it provides recreational space. So, like I said, I think that story very much summarizes a lot of the way timber workers have related to the environment. And it's also a story that I wish more people knew about. Because, like I said, this is a moment when there's a lot of vitriolic conflict occurring between environmentalists and timber workers. And I like to think that if more people knew stories like this, that maybe these conversations could be a little bit less angry and a little bit more productive. So that's one of the goals of my research, is to tell stories like this, to let people know that no, actually, people who work in the timber industry have a much more complex, deep connection to nature, one that exists and extends well beyond jobs and employment. These are places that are their homes. These are places that they care deeply about. And they are better allies than they are enemies. So I would love to take some questions.
Wow, thank you, Stephen. Um, I think we're a small enough group. I'm just going to open it up. Perhaps we can just self-organize here.